Hello and welcome everybody, this is Roland from graphicmotion.com and it is tutorial time again. In this tutorial we are creating this really cool looking complex Plexus network setup, and the special trick here is that I will show you how you can access the points in a Plexus network to add placeholders, and then you can put in titles or even images and videos. For this technique we will use a little bit of Cinema 4D and the main part will be done in After Effects. If you like my content, then please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, and if you want to support me and need some fancy After Effects templates for your video productions, then please check out my website, which is graphicmotion.com. And now without further ado, let's jump right into the tutorial. So in Cinema 4D, I first of all want to create my basic 3D mesh that I will then use to import into After Effects, and that will be the base for our network. So in this case, I want to create not a cube, but I want to create a sphere. And I want to make sure that this sphere is an icosahedron sphere. And I want to drop down the segments here a little bit because I don't want to have that many points in my network. But actually, you're already deciding how many points you have in your network by setting up the segments of this sphere. So if I drop this down, you see, then it looks like this. And this is a really good structure for Plexus because the distance between these points is more or less equal. And this is exactly what we want. So now we have to get this over into After Effects as an OBJ because Plexus can read OBJs. So let's export it as a wavefront OBJ. And I think that these are all the default settings here. So that should be fine. Let's click OK. And you see I already exported this here, so I don't have to do it again, but actually it doesn't really matter. One thing before I export and save it, I want to make it bigger. I could scale it in Plexus later on, but I prefer to do it right here because later on I will do a bit more work in Cinema 4D, and so I have the right scale here already. Good, so let's export this again. Go to OBJ and just save it here as my sphere and overwrite this. Now let's move to After Effects. In After Effects, I want to create a new composition, and this will be my Plexus network composition. And I want to use this HDTV preset, and I will make it 10 seconds long. Now let's create a new solid, my Plexus solid. Oops. And let's create the Plexus effect on this solid. First of all, we have to create a geometry, and therefore we click on Add Geometry in the Plexus Object panel, and let's choose OBJ. Now I have to import my OBJ, of course. So let's import the sphere OBJ, and to use it in Plexus, I have to drag it in my timeline here. Now I can specify the layer where my OBJ is, and you see immediately that now the points of my OBJ, the vertices, are visible. So let's just change a few settings here in the points renderer, and I just will set the opacity to 100 and just colorize them in a nice turquoise color. Okay, now let's add another renderer, and I want to add a lines renderer, and this lines renderer needs a bit of a bigger distance so that the lines will be visible, like so. If I go too far, you see that I get more lines between the points, but actually I don't want that many lines, so I just reduce this so that they are quite thin, something like that. And I also want to change the opacity and the coloring here, so let's set this up like this. And you see now I have a really nice 3D representation of my OBJ in Plexus, and I can now of course rotate this, and I can animate the scale here as you see. So this was actually how I animated this scale of the structure. And you see if I go beyond a certain point, then the lines will disappear. And this only has to do with the distance setting that is set here. So if you animate this, you have to animate this value too to get your lines back. But for now, I don't want to scale this. What we want to do now is we want to create another structure that is surrounding our sphere here, with the same amount of points, but I want to access the position data of these points. And this is something that is not easily possible in After Effects and in Plexus, because right now I cannot really find out where the position of this point, for example, is. There is a workaround for that, and therefore we have to use lights. You can create points from lights in Plexus, and of course After Effects light has a 3D position, and I can link objects to it, like layers or placeholders or whatever. And this is the way how I will set this up. But therefore we need Cinema 4D again. So let's jump back into Cinema 4D and let's see how we can set this up. In Cinema 4D, first of all, I create a light. And then I add a cloner. And I want to clone the light onto the points of my sphere. So let's choose object here. And let's drag in our sphere. And let's make sure that we distribute this on the vertices. Now I have one light for each of these points. Now I want to extend these out a little bit, and therefore we could use a plane effector. So let's set this up, and actually I want to extend them on the z-axis here, maybe something like 400. Let's take a look here. And this is also the reason why I set up the scale of my sphere right in Cinema 4D, because now I can just see it better, how far the distance is and how my network will look like. So if we take a look here, yeah, actually it doesn't look too bad. Now I want to offset them a little bit, and therefore I will use a random effector. So let's add a random effector, and let's distribute this a little bit further, maybe 80 on X, 80 on Y, and maybe let's see 200 on Z. So let's see how this looks like. Doesn't look too bad. I want this to animate, so I can change my random mode from random to noise, because here I have an animation speed, and if I set this down to something like 10%, let's see how fast this is now animating. You see that they're wobbling around a little bit, and actually let's just increase the value on X and Y a little bit so that they are wobbling around more on these axes. Let me quickly take a look at that. This doesn't look too bad, but for my taste it's a little bit too small. So let's go to the plane effector and just increase this a little bit. So maybe 500 here. Let's see. Now they're wobbling around nicely. I think this should do. So before we export this now for After Effects, we have to set up our scene to the same duration as my After Effects composition. So in the project settings, I want to set the FPS to 25 because this is the frame rate that I use in After Effects, and I also want to do this in my render settings. I think it doesn't really matter because I won't render, but just that I have the same values in here. And now I will set the duration here to 250 frames. This is also what I have in After Effects. So how can we get these lights now into After Effects? You know that you can import Cinema 4D files into After Effects, but a cloner will not be visible in After Effects. So we have to get these position of these animated lights somehow to After Effects. And there's a very, very simple workaround to do that. So first trick in this tutorial, we select the cloner directly. Then we go to Export, and we export this as an FBX. And here we have to set this up a little bit. So first of all, we want to export only the selection. Then we only want to export the lights, and don't check instances because this will not work. So uncheck this. We actually really need nothing else. We need no camera. We need nothing here, nothing here, nothing here, nothing here. So everything here should be fine. The y-axis, sometimes this is a little bit difficult to set up in After Effects, but we'll deal with this later. I will just leave it on default for now. And yeah, that's it. So animation is important, that the tracks and bake all frames is activated, and then I go to OK. And I export this FBX, and you see I already have my FBX here, so I will just override it, my light setup here. And now what we can do is that we just turn off everything that we have in this scene. So let's turn off everything here, and let's re-import by going to File and Merge Objects, this lights FBX setup. Let's click OK. And you see, here are my lights. And the cool thing, if we open this null that was exported, you see now we have all the lights, and all of them have animation keyframes on them. They have an animation part on it. And this kind of data I can import into After Effects and use it in Plexus. So this is very cool. There's actually one light in the middle here, and this was probably the light, the original light, and I actually don't need this here. I cannot even select it. This is interesting. Let's take a look at that. Or is this, which light is this? Oh, this is this light. Okay, no, I don't have to care about this because I will delete these things anyway before exporting. So let's do that. Let's delete all the things that were here and just keep our animated lights here in this null. Now let's go to save this project as a new Cinema 4D file. And I will now call this my light setup import because I will import this into After Effects. So let's select this and overwrite this. And now we will move to After Effects again. In After Effects, I can now import my Cinema 4D file directly. And sometimes this seems as it would crash, but if we are lucky, it will not crash. You see that he has to calculate quite a bit. I'm not sure why this is, but you see now my Cinema 4D file is here. And let me save this project because otherwise it crashes again on me, and it happened a few times. So it's not the first time that I'm recording this tutorial. So let's see. Okay. Now let's continue, and let me bring in my Cinema 4D file into my composition. And here we can simply click extract. And this will extract all the 3D data of my scene. All the lights are here, and it also created a camera. So let's delete this Cinema 4D file again because we don't need this anymore. And let me rearrange these lights a little bit because actually I want these on top of my Plexus layer right here. And I also want to move my camera on top of everything. So let's bring this up here. And now, just to make this a little bit easier to work with, let's hide these for now. Okay. So now you see I have all my lights in my scene, and they are also animating, which is excellent because then I can use these with Plexus. But you also see that now this is somehow offset, and this just has to do with the different axis center, Cinema 4D and After Effects. You're probably familiar with that. And we can simply correct this by going into Plexus and changing the position of our OBJ to 0, 0. So 0, 0, 0, and we can also set this to 0 as well. And then it is exactly in the middle of our scene here. Now let's go to my camera and set this up. And I want to use a bit of a wide angle camera here because this will create some nice depth here, maybe 20 is a bit too much. Let's go with 24 for now. Let's set up the position and the rotation for this, and I will zero out everything except the Z axis. So let's zero out everything here like so. And now let's just dolly in a little bit. Okay, this looks good. Now we can set up our grid with these lights. So let's go to my Plexus layer and let's add in another geometry. And this time we will use layers, and by default you see that this already uses lights. Now if I press play, you will see that there are already some points generated because this is my points renderer. But now I want to actually create two groups. I want to create a separate group for my inner structure, and I want to create a separate group for my outer structure. So let's just create group number 1, and my Plexus OBJ will be the base of group number 1. Then I also want this point renderer here to be group number 1, and I also want this lines renderer here to only affect one group, group number 1. And now you see that my lights get nothing. So let's set up a new points renderer that is actually affecting our lights, and let's actually also change my layer object here to group number 2. And my point renderer that I created down here, I will set up to group number 2. Let's increase the size here to 4, and I also want to change the color here to the same color that I used in my network here. And let's change this also to 100 opacity, and now I have my points back. but this time on a separate group. Now let's add in another renderer, and we will also set this second lines renderer to group number 2. So let's go to one group and specify group number 2. Let's increase the distance here until we see them in the scene, like so. I don't want too many of these actually, just a few. And I also want to specify my color here, and the opacity is fine for now. And I think the scale is also fine for now. So if we press play, we see now we have already a quite nice moving grid. So the next step is to create lines between my inner structure and my outer structure. And to do that, we have to use a beams renderer. So let's add in a beams renderer. And by default, the beams renderer is set to object. So it just traces my layer, my lines layer and my OBJ. But I want to have groups. So straight lines in between the groups. And if you take a look now, it created straight lines between these points and my lights. But you also see that this is somehow a little bit strangely orientated. So we can fix this with a very simple hack here. So let's go to my OBJ scale and uncheck uniform scale. And if we now just reverse the object scale on Y, then you see it jumps back to its right orientation. And this has to do, I think, with the orientation and the exporting from Cinema 4D to After Effects. Yeah, and you see you can really easily change it. Now let's set up a rotation control. But before we do that, let me quickly make these beams a little bit more beautiful. So let's go to my beams renderer. Let's set up a color and an opacity. And for the color, I use the same color as here. And for the opacity, 50, I think it's okay. Maybe we just make these a little bit thinner, like that. That looks quite good. You see now we already have a very nice and very complex network, actually. Cool. Let's save at this point. Now, the next step is that we can set up a rotation. And to set up a rotation, I have to quickly unhide my lights. So let's unhide my lights. And let's create a new null object that I will use to control my lights. So let's bring this on top here of all my lights right here, make it 3D. And I will just rename this to lights control. And now I just want to select all my lights and parent these to this null. So let's parent these to the null. Oh, one mistake, sorry. I will undo this for a moment, because actually I have to position the null in the middle of my scene. So 0, 0, 0. This is important, otherwise this will not work. So again, now let's just link this, the lights to my null. And now I have my light control here. And I also want to set this up so that I can control my rotation of my Plexus object in the middle with this null. So let's go to Plexus and let's go to the Y rotation and Alt-click the stopwatch to create an expression, and then we just link this to my Y rotation right here, because then I can simply rotate it like this. And now we see one more problem. If we rotate it to the side, the Z-axis is also wrong, and let's fix this in our Plexus setup quickly. Just invert Z-axis. No, this did not work. Maybe it was the X-axis. Let's set this to minus. Yeah, okay. It was the X-axis actually. And now you see if I spin it around. Okay, now this axis is also messed up. Okay, let's see. Maybe I have to. No, this is not working now. Troubleshooting. Let's see. The Y-axis is good. The X-axis is messed up. Okay, now let's try it another way. And there is actually another way how we can solve this problem. Let's see. Let's go to my lights control and let's go into this scale here and now try to invert the Z-axis here. And now let's see if I rotate this now. Now everything is all right. So yeah, if you have axis problems, then just change or just invert the scaling of the light control by of course, unchecking this constraint proportions first, or you can also try to fix it here in the scale. It's always a bit of a trial and error here. So, but now we get this set up, and yeah, it's nicely animating, it's rotating. Now we could animate this. Let's just add in an expression, just because it's a little bit simpler for the sake of this tutorial. And you see now we have a nice rotation, and my lights are still animating nicely. And I can still access all of these points. And this is exactly what I need. So to make this network a little bit more beautiful and more complex and interesting, I will add in another renderer. And in this case, we want to use a triangulation renderer. And with this triangulation renderer, I want to affect only the vertices of one group. And in this case, it is group number 2. And if we now increase this distance here, you will see that we get some triangles appearing like this. And I don't want to have that many, so let's just reduce this down a little bit, something like that. And let's also reduce the opacity here quite a bit. And then I can, of course, specify color. Maybe we can change this a little bit, so just that we have some slight variation in here. Okay, and now you see what we have. We have this really nice triangulation going on. And if I want to have more triangles, I just increase this slider slightly, and then they will get also a bit more opaque, so you can really art direct the look of your network. And by the way, if you want to change the size of these lights, you can also simply use your control null here. If I check this and go to scale and activate the constraint proportions again, now I can just scale this up. You see what this does. Now I can make my structure bigger. Of course, again, I have to come into my Plexus settings and then set up this distance. We could also do this with an expression if we want, but you see that you have full control. And this was also the animation that I created, the build-up animation. I just animated this out, and then I faded in my triangulation and my lines. So you can set up really cool animations using these controls. But to make this tutorial not too long, I will only show you one more thing. And this is how you can add placeholders to the lights now, because this was the whole thing, because why we created it with lights and not only with Plexus. So let's do that. Let's create a placeholder quickly. So I will create a new composition and make this my placeholder. And now we will make this a little bit smaller. Doesn't need to be that big. And let's add in a title here. Just something like the Plexus Network Tutorial. And I don't know which font I have here. Oh, that's from my last project. Let's do something simple here. Let's just make it way smaller. Yeah, that looks okay. And I will just align it quickly so that it's sitting in the middle of my placeholder here. And let's add in another color here. And no, maybe we will also just use the same color or a similar color that I had in my network, maybe a bit more bluish, something like that. And let's drag in my placeholder into my scene, and let's make it a 3D object. Now you see, if I change this to 3D, that the look of this changes. And this is because all of these lights are, of course, creating light information, and this is affecting my 3D layers. So if you create a 3D layer here, make sure that you turn off accept shadows and accept lights, so that we don't get any information out of these lights. Now we can just put this on one of our lights. Let's quickly take a look at our animation, and let's choose a light which makes sense. And I think I will just put it to this light here. And now we'll just unhide my lights for a moment to check which one this is. So again, I have to, which one was it now? I forgot it. Yeah, I wanted to use this one here. So this is light number 40. Okay, so let's go to my placeholder. Let's link this to light number 40. It's down here. And let's see its position now. And if I set this to 0, 0, 0 now, you see that it is exactly placed on my light. So now you see it comes into the scene here and is rotating around nicely. Of course, it is now right in the middle. So what I could do now is I could just move it up a little bit so that it is floating above my point here. And what you can do, of course, is bring in here everything like pictures or videos or graphic elements, whatever you want. And this way we can create these nice placeholders. So what I did in my template is actually I just right click on my placeholder layer and go to transform. And then I use auto orient and set this to orient towards camera. It will spin it a bit, but if you go to the rotation now and just change this to 0, 0, 0, and actually in this case we have to spin it 180 on X. Yep. Then this should point directly to the camera throughout the whole animation. And this makes it, of course, more readable, but it still travels through the 3D space with our point in Plexus. And this is really cool because now we can just duplicate this placeholder. And of course, if you want to create another placeholder, you would have to duplicate it here as well and then exchange it. But I guess you're familiar with that. Now we could just put this to another light. Let's say light number 18. Let's go to the position, zero it out, and move it up a tiny bit. And now we have another placeholder in here, which will travel with this light. And this way you can also specify which lights are used. So you don't have to put a placeholder to all the lights because then it actually will be a bit crowded in here. But you can now alt direct and create your really complex network, and these placeholders are perfectly following along. Okay guys, so this is it for this tutorial. I really hope that you learned some new techniques that you can now apply for your own productions. And if you make something fancy, then please post it in the comments here. I'm always interested what people do with my tutorials. Again, if you like my content, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. And if you need some fancy After Effects templates and projects, then please visit my website. There you can also find a bunch of free stuff and of course all my free After Effects templates as well. So thank you very much for watching and I really hope to see you soon. Goodbye.